All right, hello everybody. Thank you and welcome for coming to the final talk of LTUX tonight. Our host, our panelist today will be Jenna Perkin.
Hello.
Current junior at LTU and video game YouTube essayist.
I do that too, yes.
Game researcher?
Sometimes.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I've
done it before.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to share about yourself today?
Well, yeah, so I've done some research with Dr. Ahu Yolach and Dr. Julia Kiernan, which I'll be drawing on in this presentation a bit. I tend to focus on game studies specifically in the realm of narrative. I've previously spoken at the Meaningful Play Conference and the International Conference on Narrative. And a couple of the things from those presentations will be drawn on in this presentation, so I'm excited to share that.
Perfect. Take it away.
All right, cool jams. The crazy thing is I basically know everybody except for you. Hi, nice to meet you. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. All right, so like I said, I am Jenna Perkin. I am a game design student. I'm focused on narrative, and particularly in game studies. And I believe in learning through existing and how conversation and meaningful conversation can help us better understand individuals and experience. I think that we can create conversations also through games. And when we can create conversations through games and we can learn through conversations, we can also learn through games. And I think that in a general sense, we're here today because games have failed to subvert bigoted and discriminatory cultural norms. So we must critically analyze narrative successes and failures to ensure that games are used meaningfully and successfully. So I'm going to be criticizing representation, not to criticize the idea of representation or diversity, but to say that we can do better. We can be more sincere, and what we have right now doesn't live up to the needs of our culture. So for the next hour or so, it's just you, me, and my 10 pages of single-space notes. So let's do this. So how do people engage with experience? When we play a game, we're disconnected because we're viewing the game through a screen. We're seeing the images without the context that created those images. So we're only seeing one thing, one side of the game. So we see the work of a studio, but we don't see the studio itself. We are disconnected from their culture and their work, which means that we're also disconnected from any problems of crunch, harassment, inequity, or pay discrimination. So we see work without fundamentally understanding the artists. There's a quote here that I'm going to draw from Dixon that says, the ontology of art has implications for how we should interpret paintings, like Picasso's, given that an artwork is a historically informed object. If we want to inquire into its meaning, moral or otherwise, we should interpret the artwork as a particularly historically informed object. When we inquire into the meaning and effect of Picasso's nude woman in a red armchair, which is shown here, the object of interpretation we're concerned with is not the painting's visual forms alone, but the painting as a whole with its historical identity, the artwork. The painting's balmy, curvaceous forms are only the beginning. Now this is from an article called Artists Who Were Actually Terrible People. So when we see this, we're getting this historically and culturally informed piece of art without the actual history or culture that has informed it. So we must consider the creators and artists alongside with the games and media that we experience. Individuals must be able to critically think about the represented images, and we can only do that when we have the time to stop and think about it and how it was created and how it's informed in culture. In something like a movie, sometimes seeing these representations, it's harder to really critically analyze it because they're images as they pass by. What separates games is the fact that the player has agency and they also spend more time here. So these images don't just pass by, they're there and people are interacting with them. So representation is understood as reality. When people see something in a game or any piece of media, they begin to turn that thing into reality, which can ultimately distort people's interpretations of reality. Because to those outside the experience, representations of the experience define stereotypes and expectations because they don't get to have that experience themselves. So cultural expectations and stereotypes define how players engage and understand. So the expected false stereotypes that we see are indicative of how players then understand the game narrative. And if games reinforce stereotypes in representing experience, Those stereotypes are normalized through play and experience that then defines that representation from the living digital world into our real world. There's a sense of embodiment and engagement. When we play the game, we are engaged, we're embodying the representation. And so we no longer consider that filter into the failures in that representation. So while playing, players might not have time to critically evaluate the images that are being presented to them, leaving them with a little barrier of protection against false stereotypes that are represented. For instance, this image from the opening cutscene of the Telltale Walking Dead games, I was at a talk with Kishona Gray, and she brought this up to say that this was the first image that she saw, a black man in the back of a police car. This might seem like something that we don't really consider, but the fact that that is how the game introduces itself, this isn't an image that people want to see. This is an image that can be harmful. It can promote these problems because we aren't getting the context of these characters or the situation. We're just seeing this image. And from research that I did with Dr. Kiernan, we talked about how outdated models of representation, particularly for women's trauma, have overrepresented hegemonic views of women's trauma while not adequately representing legitimate trauma experienced by women. It's hard to compare the experience of being a black person in the car to that because they are drastically different things. But ultimately, when we see these things in the game space, we are unfamiliar with how these things are affecting our real world. Indeed, so in this quotation, we see that games provide a representational trace of both individual and collective activity and how it changes over time, enabling the research to unpack the bidirectional influence of self and society, how a given socio-cultural context shapes and influences individual activity and meaning-making through socialization and enculturalization, and how the individual shapes and influences the culture in which he or she participates in return. So players engage based on their defined lived experiences. So socio-cultural contexts define how players understand that which is presented to them. That is what creates this connection between the game, individual, and culture. Players can only understand representation based on their lived experience, so the most socially and culturally normalized experiences then become the ones that are most normally understood. So the most represented voices then become the ones that define what representation means and what representation is. And because, for instance, there are more straight players than queer players, straight players begin to define queer representations and narratives. So for queer narratives, they can be misunderstood by the larger body of players, thus shifting how the game is socially and culturally understood. Because then the game is seen as straight media and not queer media, despite the intentions of the developers. So we continue to consume based off of expectation and not reality, which then defines reality. So then in Bo Rupert's article about straightwashing Undertale, he says that, to the contrary, through queer erasure and a subsequent reframing of the game, this rhetoric has actively worked to draw attention away from the game's queerness and rewriting Undertale as heteronormative, effectively straightwashing the game. So the intended representation of the game can be overridden by how audiences engage with the game. So representation is defined by both developers and players, because it doesn't matter what the developers do, it's how the players understand it. And it doesn't matter what the players understand because the developers' intentions might be different. So representation must be resolute and sincere to be meaningfully understood. And only when meaningfully understood can representation lead to a legitimate change in culture. And this ties into stereotype and expectation, as well as an image that is incredibly important from Grand Theft Auto, but also one that is disturbing and unpleasant to look at. So if representation is defined by stereotype, then people are defined by expectation. So we create a false sense of certainty regarding experience and identity. In Grand Theft Auto 5, there's a very poor portrayal of transgender women that creates a false and distorted sense of reality. And the player, using that false sense of reality, then thinks of this as an insult that leads them to real-world harm. So perceptions of reality and justifications for treatment of individuals are often found in media and pop culture. So exclusionary beliefs lead to more exclusion. Media forces us to re-engage and rethink specific fields of representation in order to develop our cognitive understanding of people and experience. There's a demand for intentionality in how we represent characters and lived experiences. But then that poses the question, why games? Why is this relevant to games? Why is there a bigger change for games? And it's because, as we discussed, in a game, the player is agentive, not just in engaging with false representations in passing, but continuing to participate in those representations that then reinforce those beliefs as well. So games show more of the characters because that character is not just related to what the player sees, but how the player plays. The specific characters and actions in the game define how the player is engaging with the world, not just in passing. So the connection between the player and character becomes more personal when there is freedom and agency. Therefore, game characters can feel more poignant and tangible, just as the experiences they represent. So when we see these representations in a game, they begin to feel more indicative of reality than in other pieces of media. So images are not seen as mediated representations of reality, but they're seen as indicative elements of a falsely perceived reality. In this quote, we see that the proliferation of new sophisticated media technologies makes it difficult, if not impossible, to discern the differences between images and reality. Many media images are hyperreal, that is, more real than real. Thus, the notion of representation becomes problematic. These problematic representations cannot always be challenged because those with the adequate knowledge and power to challenge those representations have already been villainized by those same representations. So false stereotypes create exclusion, limiting the amounts of critical response we have to problematic representations in the first place. We're drawn away from the industry that deliberately mocks the existence of individuals through false stereotypes. And then it leads to this broader point that it is not the responsibility of the oppressed to cure the oppressor. Our solution to many things is to speak up, but that demands that those who are marginalized justify their own existence and emotions to a group that is seen as the default form of being human, a group that will already lean towards a rejection of those identities of marginalized individuals. So it makes the oppressor the judge of whether or not their own oppression is justified, which leads us to Hogwarts Legacy. Now, you're laughing because you know where I'm going to go with this. Any presentation on ethics in games is going to have to discuss Hogwarts Legacy at some point. That's the world we live in now. I'm not going to discuss this game in specifics, but rather based on what is revealed upon the perceptions of oppression. So upon release, there were many resources explaining the problems of the game. Insulting racist, anti-Semitic representations, transphobic histories of the creator of the franchise, problematic creatives and producers, the distribution of funds from the game to anti-trans organizations. There's a lot of things that were problematic here, and they were very well documented and clear. But then, in my experience, people would come up to me and ask me to explain why it was bad, often framing it as, I don't really see what the problem is, implying that because I'm transgender, I then have to explain to them why the game is problematic in the first place. It becomes then my responsibility for them to understand these things, and it does not become their responsibility to learn. So this is seen as the right to not research. These individuals could just investigate resources, but instead are detriment, sorry, what does my notes say? Seen as a right to not research. These individuals believe that it is their right to not explore these things. And if I couldn't convince them, I must be wrong, unwilling to actually listen to be convinced of why their beliefs are problematic. Thus, their problematic beliefs are perpetuated. Harmful stereotypes perpetuate the imbalance of power dynamics between marginalized and non-marginalized individuals. So when designing, it is a responsibility of the designer to learn and understand those things that their designs represent. Without intentionality and sincere representations, games only further perpetuate the inequity found in culture. When games perpetuate certain stereotypes in representation, legitimate and sincere representations almost begin to seem fraudulent. And that's where we run into the situation with Abby from The Last of Us Part 2. Guess what? Games have perpetuated false and sexualized representations of women that have further marginalized women within broader game cultures as well as broader culture. That shouldn't come as a surprise, but because of those representations and false representations, something that is a sincere or legitimate representation begins to seem vague and unreal to some individuals. leading to backlash when Abby was first revealed. Because sexualization and a specific form of femininity are the expectation, Abby is seen as fraudulent and unrealistic. Realistic depictions of women were insulting to men who would rather see a boob window than an empowered woman. The loudest responsibility was from people outside the identity and outside of the identity and experiences being represented, then projecting their frustrations onto people who were actually being sincerely represented. When Abby was first shown, the reactionary movement called her transgender because she was muscular, and people correlated being muscular to masculinity, despite the existence of muscular women in the real world. So even a false stereotype can be defined by oppressive stereotypes. So stereotypes indicate how people expect individuals and people and groups to react, as if many diverse cultures are actually homogenized with identical experiences and identities, which is obviously untrue. We cannot broadly simplify how individuals and collective groups of people behave. That is not the end of that page of notes. So how many times do we hear things like, I don't mind queer characters as long as their personality isn't just being queer, or I don't mind queer characters as long as they act straight, or why do we need to make characters gay if they just act straight anyway? All of these are rooted in the idea that being straight is the default way of being human, and that we should build everything else around that straightness. People respond strongly to queer characters because they view the existence of that character as a deviation from the default. So when representing queer characters, how do we effectively convey their identities and use those characters to create meaningful cultural change and empathy? Games can be used to subvert the expectation that being straight is the default. And so by replacing images of default straightness with diverse bodies of characters, that helps eliminate the expectations that the characters should, by default, be straight. In another quote, it is very important to critically evaluate how much, what kind, and how good or bad is the influence of video games on those who play them based on the identities and cultural values they promote, and consequently the impact it has on in the impacts upon the educational process and on society. So with that, we're going to draw into the bookstore, which is funny because several people who were working on the bookstore are in the audience right now. Hey. So we're going to tie into the story of casting for the bookstore. When we got the script, it specified that gender didn't matter, with one exception. A couple who was seeking to get married, Jamie and also Jamie, are probably the same gender, but that was the only indicator. And we made an early decision that despite the character names and the expectation of gender correlated to those names, such as characters like Ellen or Kim, we decided that they could be played by anybody regardless of gender. So a man could play Ellen, a woman could play Josh. Our goal is intended to be inclusive with casting and cast based off of the best emotional fit and not based off of gender, which ultimately meant that we made characters gay who were written in a way that was intended to be straight. So because more men auditioned than women, non-binary or gender-fluid individuals, we saw this conversion of traditionally or expected or written to be straight characters as gay characters. And because of that inclusive casting, most relationships ended up being gay, but they were gay written with straight intentions. So we made no the script made no additional points based off of the sexuality of the character, but we just played them with same gender actors. Is this problematic that we're gay washing straight relationships, or that a difference that like identity impacts experience? Obviously, a gay character may behave in a different way than a straight character. At the same time, what we decided is that this was a script about love and not sexuality. So we could cast in an inclusive way without taking away from what these characters were meant to be in the first place. The only thing that would make this problematic then is the presumption that gay characters cannot love each other, which is not true. Which this leads into this idea of bisexuality as a mechanic as we turn this back into game design. When we see bisexuality as a mechanic, it's the idea that the player, regardless of their gender, can marry anyone they want, regardless of gender, which then makes every single character automatically bisexual, but they're bisexual not in the way that actually represents bisexual identities, but in a way that serves the functions of the game. So it negates the concept of diverse sexualities when every sexuality is homogenized and used to benefit the game mechanics rather than the game narrative. Sexuality is converged into a homogenized state of being. It's intended to be inclusive, and to be fair, it is. This brings in the difference between inclusivity and representation. Bisexuality as a mechanic is fundamentally inclusive because any player, regardless of their gender, can then project their, or regardless of gender or sexuality, can project their sexuality onto the characters and marry who they want and do what they want and not be held back by sexualities as represented in the game. But it doesn't actually end up representing sexualities at all. It makes sexuality invisible for the convenience of the player. So it relies on ambiguity rather than canonical sexuality, which almost creates a sexuality roleplay, where the player projects their sexuality onto the characters as they engage. So when you romance a character in these games, how is that character's sexuality perceived? It's perceived as an attraction to the character's gender, regardless of what that gender may be. By projecting the player's individual sexuality onto the game avatar, they ultimately also project sexuality onto each character in the game. Each character defaults to sexual attraction to the player, technically bisexual for games with binary gender options, but ultimately more player sexual than bisexual. So does making characters definitively gay or straight make the game less inclusive? If a gay character exists, then straight characters would also likely exist, which leads to a situation where a gay individual who is already oftentimes rejected in society and culture, homophobic and oppressive culture, would then also be rejected in the game that they play in an attempt to escape from the world. It is harder for a player to empathize with the experiences of an individual if those individual experiences are inadequately represented. So in this case, the game no longer becomes this escape. It becomes another representation of reality, a reality that is often cold, hard, and oppressive. So bisexuality as a mechanic creates inclusion, but neither empathy nor legitimate representation. So we must diversify representation of sexuality, not converge them, because then how can we be sincere while also then we can be sincere while also promoting empathy. But how can we do this without eradicating the inclusivity of this mechanic? I think the answer is that there is no universal answer. And this isn't also a condemnation of the games that employ this strategy. It's not a bad strategy, just one that is imperfect and trying to solve a problem that may be difficult to solve. So it brings to question, what does sincere actually mean? Sincere representations are true to experience, even if not true to reality. If every representation was true to reality, gay characters wouldn't be able to roam without being called a slur, women would be groped by other characters in the game, racism would limit what certain characters would be able to do. Reality is oppressive and not inclusive. That inequity, while real, does not need to be represented in the games. We don't want to depict stories of discrimination and hate, despite the fact that they may be valuable for some situations, and they are practical for some situations. That isn't the universal narrative that we want to tell. We want to be able to tell stories of love and inclusion, and not just hate and discrimination. Because harmful images shown to the players, particularly in this case queer players who experience discrimination, we don't need to see that discrimination in every facet of media, regardless of how real it is. It can create empathy, but at the expense of the player and the images that they are exposed to. So we call for sincere representations, but that call is a call for depictions of emotions, love, and acceptance and empathy, ensuring that identities are seen in the legitimacy of lived experiences of individuals that share that identity through emotion. If a representation is insincere to that which is being represented, we experience a falsely constructed identity, and that's what the players then engage with. And that leads to situations of something such as digital blackface, where a black character is designed by a white designer and is insincere to legitimate experiences that black people experience. So when we create diverse characters, the designer must consider and understand diverse experiences, which calls for empathy and engagement with a diverse body of people. Another quote says, "The criminalization of black and brown bodies throughout society in general and video games specifically are the profiling of black and brown gamers that is endemic to game culture. It illustrates not only how race operates within video games, but the dialects between the virtual and lived, the spaces of play, and the spaces of the everyday." And that is a quote from Leonard and Gray, Kishana Gray, who we mentioned earlier in this presentation. So cultural racism extends into the game development spaces, particularly when those spaces are hegemonic and non-inclusive. White designers end up creating narratives of black experiences. And it may seem inclusive to write about underrepresented experiences, but ultimately when the wrong person does that, they conforms black narratives to white experiences. For instance, the infamous "What If Miles Morales Became Thor" comic, which was written by white writers and was horribly insincere to the experiences of black individuals, and it reveals this further problem of digital blackface. So we create based off of experience, identity, and beliefs. So to argue that art can be separated from the artist implies that the experiences and individuality are inherently disconnected, despite experiences informing individuality. Art cannot be separated from the artist because the artist is an individual who has had experience, and that cannot be unlinked from the individual's creativity. That leads us to Florence, a game about love, abuse, and individuality. This was a game that Ahu and I used in our study of critical thinking in games. Florence was written by a man who we learned after discussing this game to be extraordinarily problematic and sexist, which was concerning because initially we had praised the game for sincere and grounded representations that felt like they combated these negative representations and false representations. It was a representation that felt distinctly human. So when we heard about the things that had been done by the creator, we were disappointed and concerned, and it caused us to stop and reflect on the game that we had just praised to see if it was actually worthy of praise in the first place. So we had a realization through this that people can fail to live by the moral goods that they endorse in the media they create. And suddenly, because of that, the messages do seem less sincere. Ethics and narrative representation extend to the lived ethics of the designers. The bigotry of a bigoted individual is present in what they design and create because they create on bigoted beliefs. There's a reason that designers often create based off of other individuals' experiences, and it's because they think that they have an adequate understanding of that experience, and that an adequate understanding of that experience is owed to them. They think that they're an authority of the lived experiences of other individuals. They think that speaking on those experiences as an authority makes them look in touch to a body of individuals that they know little to nothing about. But most importantly, there is still inequity in the game industry, perpetuated by these previous three problems, that makes it harder for women and marginalized individuals to actually share their voice in the industry. Another quote I have from Orme says, "While more diversity in game development promises to bring fresh perspectives to a community saturated with narratives of white cisgender men, the everyone can make games movement may also obscure systemic forms of oppression that female game makers and many game makers of color experience." So simply stating that games can be made by anyone because Unity is free to use, that doesn't actually address the real problems within the game industry. Design spaces are still unwelcoming to various identities. For instance, at the Game Developers Conference, there were several stories of women being drugged. The space was unsafe for them. So this valuable resource for individuals ends up being unsafe and inaccessible to many marginalized individuals, which then perpetuates the hegemony of the games industry. The game industry is more accessible and approachable for a specific group of individuals, meaning that the experiences represented through narrative are rooted in a very specific range of experience. So in order to create equitable games that are sincere to diverse and underrepresented ideas, we must first primarily create an industry that is safe and approachable for a wider range of designers, because there are creative minds who haven't been able to be seen or heard because the spaces that they could work in are unsafe. So fundamentally, as a culture, we are made worse by the inequity we perpetuate. So our experiences and identity can be found in that which we create. Our experiences inform our creativity, and what we make will reflect who we are. Therefore, in order to be meaningful in game narrative design, we must ensure that we have diverse spaces where people can share their voices and project their experiences onto the characters that represent them. So we situate representation based on experience and identity, creating diverse game characters by collaborating with diverse bodies of individuals, which is the best solution to making diverse games, is having diverse bodies of people working on those games. Our games will be better if they are developed by people with diverse and varied experiences, because it allows for greater cultural change as well. Sharing experience and sincere representations of experience allows people to better understand those specific experiences and how they are lived, not just in how they are presented in media. So to grow as a designer, we must first grow as listeners. We must foster conversation, we must listen, and we must empathize. Fostering conversation through intentionality, but without demanding that learning from other people. Other people are not responsible for us learning about experience, but if we make intentional efforts to learn, people can then help. But it's ultimately the responsibility of each individual to take initiative to bring that change about within themselves in the first place. We must critically evaluate ourselves, and through that, critically evaluate our games. When we create empathetically through experience, we'll express all forms of our emotions, not just those that we intend to share. For instance, when Maddie Thorson created Celeste, it was not her intention for the game to represent trans individuals, because she didn't know she was trans when she made those games. But because she had those emotions in her design, they were revealed even when not intended to. So then people could relate to the emotions and understand them. And when Maddie did realize that they were trans and shared that the themes of being trans were represented within the game, many people would look on and realize that they experienced those same emotions and realize that they themselves were trans. Because Celeste didn't make anyone trans, but it made many players realize they were trans because they related and empathized with Madeline's experience and emotions. Those emotions were extensions of Maddie's emotions as well. So by honing in our emotions, we can create culture-shifting experiences. So through our games, we can subvert expectations. Another quote says, "Games are designed experiences, and as such, their study requires an understanding of the full range of human practices through which players actively inhabit those worlds and rules and texts and render them meaningful." So when we subvert expectations, we demand the player meaningfully engage with a game. Breaking stereotypes can subvert expectations, and sometimes people will think that your representation, when it subverts expectations, is erroneous, and sometimes people will actually have to engage to learn from them and understand that that experience they thought was erroneously represented was actually sincere. And it creates a domino effect that when we do create culturally shifting, subverting representations of real individuals, and that is what players then engage with, we can then help create a systemic and global change where people recognize real and legitimate experiences. Some people might not be able to change, but culture can still shift without them. We don't need everyone in order to shift culture, and culture shifts over time. So we must normalize underrepresented narratives. We have to consider characters as a tool for social change in the games we create. People can be validated through their experiences by sincere representations in the game. And then other individuals who do not share that experience can learn from it anyway. Sincere representations benefits everyone, even if that benefit isn't immediately recognized. So this calls for intentionality. To create ethical game narratives, we must first strive to be sincere. And that's what I have for y'all today.
All right, thank you so much, Jenna, for this talk today.
Absolutely.
For the remainder of the time, I'd like to open it up to the floor. If you have any questions or conversation topics you'd like to bring up, add on, please, by all means. Yes.
Hi, Jenna.
Hi, hello.
So when you talked about bisexuality as a mechanic versus the player being allowed to apply their own sexualities or certain
Right.
sexualities on characters. That compared to set sexualities of characters that players can romance, do you believe one has, I suppose, is more sincere, as you talked about, than the other? Do you suppose one has more value than the other? Do you suppose one is like better representation than the other, or are they both valuable in their own way?
Yeah, and that's sort of the dilemma I've been having, and I bring this up because it's an important discussion to be had about how we represent sexuality in the first place. But I want to make it clear that I don't condemn the use of bisexuality as a mechanic. I do think it is effective, but I also think that it is constraining and limiting at the same time, because, like we talked about, with bisexuality as a mechanic, we aren't actually talking about representation, or we aren't talking about sexuality. So players who engage with those experiences can really very easily read that game as straight, even if it is inclusive to multiple audiences. And then at the same time, we aren't actually learning about individual people and their experiences. Then the benefit is that it, helps ensure that everybody can play and engage with each individual within the game and be able to live out their experiences in this world, and the game allows for the player to have the agency to choose how they engage with the world and how they project their own sexuality into the game. I don't think that there is one solution that's better than any other, and especially because like the big difference is a game like Stardew Valley versus a game like Life is Strange. Stardew Valley is a game about the player having agency and being able to make their own decisions and not being constrained by the game in any form or facet. Whereas Life is Strange is a more linear experience with less player agency that allows for more deliberate representations of sexuality, which is very successful in the series. So I don't think there's one strategy that's better than the other. I think that it's ultimately dependent on what our game is intending to do in the first place. If we want a game that allows the player to have agency, then maybe using bisexuality as a mechanic is the best solution, but we have to think critically about how we do that. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Yes, it does.
Question over here.
Hi.
Hi, hello.
So I thought it was really interesting early on when you mentioned the straight washing of Undertale. Because I kind of found that because I just recently am playing Undertale for the first time myself. And when I first experienced Undertale, now that I'm playing it now, I realize how queer the game is.
It's very queer,
and
yes.
which I was completely oblivious to back in 2015, 2016 when it came out. Is there because I agree that there is the straight washing because I completely missed narrative, the trans narrative around Metaton and stuff like that. Is this because we talked the straight washing of it, is this an inevitable part of gaming, or is there a way we can prevent it?
I think that it's mostly indicative of just culture and society as a whole, because we do live in a culture that it deliberately favors, white identities more than, does favor white identities, but in this case favors straight identities over queer ones. So then when we talk about these spaces in which the game is discussed in the first place, the people who are most welcome in those spaces are straight individuals. And they're going to take that experience, that game, and project their own experience and identities into that, so that when they talk about the game, they are straight washing it. And then the people who see that discussion then buy into the straight washing, even if that individual is queer, because that's just how the game is perceived in the first place. So I think that there's something that designers can do, and they can be extremely overt and explicit about their representation. But at the same time, when you do that, representation can feel silly when you draw so much attention to it, but sometimes you have to. I think that ultimately, in order for those more subtle forms, it's not really subtle, but somewhat subtle forms of queer representation, I think that we need to first ensure that the spaces that discuss these games are inclusive and equitable. Because when we have queer people in those spaces discussing the game, then that straight washing can be minimized. So I think that it is as inevitable as our culture is homophobic. And if we can create a more inclusive culture, which we can do through creating more equitable games, then we can start to see a better change.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hello? Oh yeah. You mentioned about like how people cannot, well, people can insincerely represent cultures that they are not directly a part of.
Right.
Do you feel as if there is a, I know there's like one of the simple solutions is to simply hire people that have had these direct experiences, but is there a way for people that may not have had these direct experiences to include this, include things that may not have direct experience in, but want to represent this side of culture or society that they want represented or maybe need representation?
Right, and I can actually, that's a great question. I can bring up sort of an experience that I've had recently with the game that I was sharing today, Uncanny, that when we were designing the characters, which happened after all the characters had been written, we just realized we are all white creating this game, but we don't want to create a game of people that are all white. We don't want to, I don't know, converge to that sort of representation. But at the same time, we didn't have people in our team that could share experience to ensure that our representations were sincere. So we sat down and had some conversations, and we just researched. We made sure that we were being sincere. We made sure that we were not putting any people in positions that are based on stereotype. And through that, I think that we were able to create something that is sincere, though I think that it would, of course, be better if we had more people with diverse experiences in that field to be able to help with the game. But I think that at a fundamental level, people aren't resources, but there are resources out there still. And so people can make an intentionality to learn and research for themselves, even if they don't have people who share that experience with them. But then they have to critically evaluate how they're, engaging with that discussion in the first place.
Yeah, I saw in your game obviously, there wasn't any, black people in your group,
Right.
and that wasn't anything out of your bad decision making. It was just how the groups were made, and I really feel like that when I played your game, it wasn't like one stereotype I've seen like game developers use what's referred to as Japhonics, where they use the stereotypical black accent, and I really feel like this felt like a very sincere representation of my kind of culture that I grew up in Detroit, and it felt like it didn't feel like there was no harmful stereotypes. It felt like a genuine character, and I feel like you've done it well.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to hear that.
Do we have any other questions from the audience today? Comments? Thoughts?
Bless you.
Bless you.
Thank you. One of the things that you talked about that really struck home with me, even though I'm not studying for the game industry in particular, was about how difficult, if the industry itself is not a safe space for particular people, whether you're queer or a woman or a person of color or something like that. And as someone in the engineering industry, that really struck home with me. What do you think are the necessary steps for making the industry safer? Is it an entire culture shift? Is it something where if the dominant, overarching population of an industry is like, say for example, like cis, straight, white male, you know what I mean? Is it ultimately up to them? Is there anything we can do? How do we make those steps in industry itself?
Yeah, well, it ties into the similar thing that it's like, it's not the responsibility of the oppressed to cure the oppression. And I think that we're in a dangerous spot where we're close to demanding that queer people make safer spaces for themselves, or black people make safer, more inclusive spaces for themselves. It's hard to create those safe spaces, especially if we're putting the responsibility on the individuals who are oppressed in the first place. I think that specifically in the games industry, we can start to create change through indie games, maybe. Like in indie games where, creators have more freedom because they don't have to go through publishers and all that, they can then create games that are more inclusive and sincere, particularly to those to the identities that and experiences that they possess. And I think that we see that. I think we see a lot more inclusivity and sincere representation in indie game spaces. But because of how much indie game spaces are like budding and growing, if we create those changes there, I think that players can learn to expect those changes more and become more empathetic to those changes. And then if players are more accustomed to that, I think that AAA studios and bigger studios can then start to make those changes themselves. So it creates sort of a domino effect that when people see sincere representations, they may be able to better empathize. And as they learn and understand, more places can create that inclusivity. But it just starts with intentionality in the way that each individual creates, and ensuring that the spaces that they create are free. And that's where indie spaces are like hugely powerful.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Any more comments and or thoughts for today? I might have one of my own real quick. Good, okay, we're doing okay on time. All right, so my kind of question or discussion topic, kind of like dialing it back a little bit in the conversation and talking about more the game industry itself and game companies. And so we all know a lot of game companies in general, but specifically game, deep-rooted in a lot of, you know, sexism, abuse, misconduct.
Wait, really?
Yeah, newsflash. And so, you know, even as somebody who just graduated and you soon will, entering that field, it's very disheartening how widespread that is. And it's like, you know, for somebody who is like putting that in your forefront of your mind when you're deciding where you want to work, it's like, it makes it very slim, your choices and all that stuff. And I guess personal experience, won't name the company, but there was a game company that I tried looking for, and there's a position that I'm like, oh, this would be perfect for me. And then, you know, talked to my friend and just learned like, oh yeah, this was a company where the head was part of like Gamergate and like the real bad, really like notoriously bad stuff. And it's this company that's been elevated even by like people now, and like, oh my gosh, everybody apply, all this stuff. And it's just like, all of a sudden this opportunity that is like so close to me, I'm just like, I don't even want to touch it anymore. And so like, I guess how would you from your perspective, how do we even navigate that? And like, I don't know if that CEO's there anymore. Do you go there to bring a new set of eyes, new perspective to make it better? Or is it kind of irredeemable? Are some companies just irredeemable once they kind of, I don't know. It's open question, open conversation.
That's like a very difficult question.
It's difficult. It's impossible.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, though, even if I can't answer the question, we can still have a discussion around it, that the games industry simultaneously, to me, feels like one of the most inclusive, one of the least inclusive spaces, because we have this huge divide when, you know, we have indie studios that are huge now, considering how, like, ubiquitous gaming is, and these indie spaces actually have like a legitimate say in the industry in a way, and then those spaces can be inclusive, or they can't, in the situation of Florence and Mountain Games that we talked about, and then those can be some incredibly inclusive spaces that actually have legitimate opportunities for people. And then we get into other studios that are bigger or just less inclusive, which is disheartening, because it means that some of the spaces that are most inclusive for people in games are also some of the spaces that have the least funds and resources. So it's trying to solve it, or trying to find space in the industry for yourself, especially in places that aren't inclusive. I think that you're right, that like maybe there are some studios that in their current state are irredeemable. Like that one studio, like, having somebody who is like a part of Gamergate, that's like, not touching that at all, which sucks because it just creates less space for people. And so it can almost be like a rallying point, like, hey, this studio was a part of this problematic thing, and so let's try to like not support this studio. And hopefully the people who can sort of lead those charges aren't always the people who are directly harmed by it, because then it takes responsibility again off of the oppressor to cure the oppression. And I don't think there's, you know, a definitive answer. I think that there's just a continued call for cultural change, especially because when I was researching Gamergate for the presentation I gave with Ahu, I was shocked to see how many people supported it. It was really hard for me to find any resources that wasn't like Zoe Quinn's evil, like, and it was so disheartening to see that something that seems so overtly obvious to me and to us. I mean, it's literally a situation of neo-Nazis think women shouldn't be allowed to exist, and then women are like, actually, maybe we can exist. Wouldn't that be cool? And so it's like such like an overtly like obvious thing, but at the same time, there's still so much like inequity and sexism in culture that we haven't been able to really combat that or create the realization of the fact that there is a problem in the first place. So maybe for this like specific instance, it's just trying to bring more awareness into how sexism is perpetuated in culture. And if people can become more aware of that, they can become more aware of maybe we were in the wrong about Gamergate. And when we have that moment, maybe we can have a moment in this studio that's, well, maybe this person who is in charge of the studio isn't actually somebody who should be in the games industry. But from an individual standpoint, or for you specifically, it's like,
yeah,
it's hard and it sucks. Yeah.
Like part of it's like, you know, yes, can I be the person to come in with like not that and be able to spot that, and maybe they've already did their wipe of the perpetrators, you know, the bad apples, but it's just you can't help but feel gross about even considering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The fact is, like, if there's any bad apples, there's always going to be bad apples.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
you know, even as much as like people can try to hide it, or companies can put a rainbow flag up for a month, like that still doesn't negate the fact that there are problems in there, even if we pretend they don't exist.
Any final thoughts for tonight from anybody in the crowd? 8 minutes until 7:30, but I think it's not a bad spot.
8 minutes ahead of schedule. Cool jams.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Jenna.
Oh, easily, yeah.
For everybody in the stream, this is our last talk for tonight. For anybody in general, there will be at 9 o'clock, we are going to have our raffle drawings. This will not be streamed, but for anybody who may have been participating in that, that'll be the last event going on here tonight. Thank you. Coming.